often have you felt restricted to spiritual practices that often seem outdated and of little relevance in today's world? Are you discouraged to express your own creative talents and develop spiritual practices that are uniquely you? The Liturgical Rebels podcast is for people like you who want to reimagine and reconstruct their faith and spiritual practices. It's for those who want to reshape belief and journey closer to God's wholeness with peace, justice, and flourishing, not just for themselves, but for the earth and all its inhabitants. In today's episode of Liturgical Rebels, I will be in conversation with Michael Frost, an internationally recognised Australian missiologist and one of the leading voices in the missional church movement. Mike is the founding director of the Tinsley Institute, a mission study centre located at Morling College in Sydney, Australia. He is also the author or editor of 19 theological books, the best known of which is the popular and award-winning The Shaping of Things to Come. He was also one of the founders of the Forge Mission Training Network and the founder of the missional Christian community Smallboatbigsea, based in Manly in Sydney's north. He is also well known for his protests against Australia's treatment of refugees, some of which have resulted in his arrest by the New South Wales Police, as well as his advocacy for racial reconciliation, foreign aid, and gender equality. Mike, it's a pleasure to be able to chat to you. I know this is the third time that we have been trying to do this, and I'm delighted that finally we have managed to connect almost properly. So thank you for being a guest on the Liturgical Rebels podcast.
Not at all. We should explain to our listeners, we had a total blackout in Seattle or something that you dropped out, and then last time, I think it was my end, maybe the cable from Sydney to Seattle broke or something. I don't know what it was, but yes, we have had no end of trouble
Yes.
conversation.
So I'm, either it means that this is going to be the most important interview that I've done, or I don't know, but we'll see. We'll get going.
It doesn't want us to have this conversation.
Or that might be the opposite. So we'll see what happens. Because, Mike, I've been wanting to do this for ages because I have admired your work. I think since we first met in the early 2000s. And it's not just because you're a well-known writer and speaker and everything, but it's partly because I am so impressed with the way that you get involved with the issues that you're concerned about. Because I know that you've been in protests about the way that Australia treats refugees. And I must confess, if I was still living down there, I think I would have joined you.
Yep.
You've been arrested a couple of times. You've also been an advocate for racial reconciliation, foreign aid, and gender equality. It's quite an impressive list. So tell us a little more about your history and why these issues have become so important for you.
Oh, look, I grew up in somewhat affluent middle-class culture, but my parents were only kind of recently elevated to the middle class when I came along. They had grown up as quite poor working-class kids during the Great Depression, and there are all sorts of reasons for uplift in Australian society after the Second World War. But prior to that, my father, both my parents came from broken homes. My father was raised by a single mother. He was an only child during the Great Depression. It was really, really tough for him. My mother, as I said, came from a broken home. Both of them, left school at 14 or 15 to start working. And I'm only telling you all that to say they both had this very strong kind of clannish Irish Catholic working class set of values. And even though after the war they were elevated to suburbia and to some degree of affluence in the middle class, they still carried that with them. So I was raised by people with a strong commitment to social justice and to care for the poor, and to practicing hospitality and generosity, a lot of kind of Catholic social teaching, even
Mm-hmm.
though by that stage they were not church-going Catholics any longer. One of the reasons for my father's uplift was actually because of his service during the Second World War. So Australia was incredibly generous. Maybe the United States was too, but Australians were incredibly generous to those who served during that war. And he returned he was still a teenager. Oh, maybe he would have been 19 or 20 when he came back from the war. He was given a free education at university. He was given free medical health benefits for himself and his whole family for the rest of his life.
Mm.
He was given a low interest, deposit free home loan. All these things were lavished upon returned servicemen. At the same time as Australia was experiencing an economic boom. So that's what caused this uplift, which then meant that I was raised, as I said, in suburban affluence to some degree. And one of the things I've only recently discovered about all of that, Christine, was that Black Australians who served during the Second World War were not offered the same benefits at all. Not at
it,
all.
it was the same here. The
Right.
GI Bill was only for white Americans that worked,
Right.
that were in the
Incredible, isn't
war.
it?
Yeah.
Incredible. I
Mhm.
mean, these men did the same work during the
Yes.
war. Um, Aboriginal or Indigenous Australian people, men primarily, returned from the war and ended up working as drovers and farmers and labourers and people like that, never able to save enough money to buy a home, plagued with health uh, uh, struggles. Their kids, my generation, were raised in poverty.
Mhm.
That intergenerational poverty just continues. And yet here I am kind of being raised in suburbia in some affluence as a result of the direct benefits that our nation gave to returned servicemen. So I always say I am a direct beneficiary of systemic racism.
Mhm.
I look at me. I grew up in suburbia. I went to a great school. I went to university. I became a professional person. I had opportunities afforded to me because our system afforded them to people with the same color skin as mine. And
Mhm.
so I only share that because that's been a relatively recent area of study for me, looking at the treatment of returned Black Australian
Mhm.
servicemen. But all that to say, here I am, a suburban kid, being raised by kind of, very left-leaning, trade union belonging, kind of working class people. Interestingly, though, Christine, when I became a Christian, uh, I found myself living in kind of two worlds because I was at university at the time. I was protesting apartheid in South Africa and protesting nuclear arms. I was going on peace marches and doing all the kind of stuff that you do at university, I suppose. So much of which kind of was really in keeping with a lot of the values that I'd been raised by. But on Sundays, I was going to church, and I heard none of this kind of talk in the Baptist church I was attending. There, my experience of faith was really very devotional and very personal. I actually felt quite nourished and really loved and cared for and included. I felt God's great grace and mercy. This was a very personal, existential, inward experience. But I don't recall thinking it had anything to do with any of the other stuff that I was being involved in with respect to kind of protests or social justice or any of those kinds of things. And it took a long time before I came to discover that actually these two things should be on the same path, as it were. But I just saw kind of involvement in kind of political activism as being kind of secular
Mhm.
things that some
Interesting.
people
Yeah.
get into and some people don't. And then I saw my Christian faith as being a very nourishing, personal, inward, devotional type experience. I didn't see the link between those two until, oh gosh, I was probably, in my midlife by that stage.
Mm. Wow. Wow. Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? I mean, I grew up in a very conservative, I grew up middle class, upper middle class Australian. Uh, and it wasn't really until I worked in the refugee camps on the Thai Cambodian border that my whole worldview was flipped upside down.
Right.
Um, and, that's what it took. Because, like you, I hadn't heard anything about this in my Christian uh, church or, with my friends at university or any of this kind of stuff. And it's now we go to a Mennonite church, and it's the opposite, of course.
Yes, and I feel though now, I look at a lot of the people who are my students who are obviously much younger than me, and they're growing up, in some cases, in relatively conservative churches. But the notion of social justice, or at the very least, generosity and philanthropy and care for others and giving and being aware of and conscious of the kind of social, political, economic struggles of others is a lot more on their agenda than it
Mhm.
was for me in a more conservative suburban church.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's true in Australia and in Britain and Europe as well, but it's not really true as far as I can tell. Well, not within the church, it doesn't seem to be so true because you still get a lot of conservative young Christians who really have no sense of responsibility for the poor, social justice, or any of those kinds of things,
Yeah.
unfortunately. Um, but, in a way, it doesn't surprise me because Australians are known for their unconventionality, for their openness to innovation, and I think for their radical edge in many ways and their directness in communication. And I was wondering how those kinds of cultural uh, attributes had shaped your faith and the things that you're involved in as well.
Actually, it's quite helpful to hear you say all of that because when you are in Australia as an Australian, or at least me being Australian in Australia, I'm very conscious of how conservative and self-centered and consumeristic Australian culture is.
Uh-huh.
And so to hear an Australian who's been outside of Australia for a long time, kind of sort of with both an insider and outsider kind of perspective as you have, it is helpful to hear someone say some of those positive things about Australians. I do think what you say about us is broadly true. Um, I've always been interested to see how many Australians have quite a significant voice in the American and international church, yourself
Mhm.
included. But I'm thinking about Alan Hirsch and Christine Kane and Mark Sayers and Michael Bird. There's so many of us now that are kind of speaking in that. And I wonder whether part of it is that we also have a kind of we certainly have a Western perspective, but we sit in an island at the bottom of the Pacific near the edge of Southeast Asia. We can't help but be conscious of the fact that we don't really belong where we've been placed in the world, that we
Mhm.
are a Northern or European culture, broadly speaking. Australia's incredibly multicultural now, but certainly from our roots, that we're kind of out of place and out of time, and that we work really hard to be conscious of what's going on in the world, to find
Yes.
our place in that world.
Yes.
Maybe more so than Europeans or Americans would, who might feel much more at home and comfortable in their place, their sense or their place in the world.
Mhm.
We often feel like we're jostling in with our shoulders to get our kind of place at the table in a way. And maybe that makes us a little more keen, a little bit more upbeat, and very perceptive. I think we look hard at what's going on.
Yes. Oh, I think so. Well, and the directness as well, because that is
Yeah.
definitely an Australian characteristic. And I think, for people like yourself, the directness carries in a way that, from other cultures it doesn't always do, I think.
I was in Sweden once and somebody thanked me after a conference, thank you for giving that presentation. And you speak in a very arrogant fashion, he said. And I thought, okay. And I talked to him afterwards. I said, did I come across as being rather arrogant? And as we were talking, what he meant to say was in a very forthright or very direct kind of
Very
way.
direct,
But
yes.
English was his second language. And so it came up, thank you for that very arrogant presentation.
Well, I think some people can confuse those two, because when you're being direct, people think you're kind of putting yourself above others sometimes
Yeah.
too. So it can have
But
some of that
I'd
to
have
it.
to be honest with you, Christine. When I first really, how far back do I go in this story? But going back to what I was saying before, I was in this conservative Baptist church. I never heard anything about social justice or anything like that. It was a very devotional, personal experience. And I ended up going into theological college and into ministry, and I ended up kind of joining that system. But I became incredibly disillusioned with it because I found myself having to kind of bifurcate so much of who I was, or I either forget part of who I was and just orient myself around a kind of existential spiritual experience of God that had kind of no legs in the world of politics or economics or society and the like. And it just got to the point I couldn't live with that any longer. And I ended up kind of quitting ministry, ended up teaching at a community college just to make ends meet while I kind of did a lot of reading. And in fact, Tom Sine's work was some of the work I read back then, along with people like David Bosch and Stanley Hauerwas and Walter Brueggemann, God rest his soul. And was kind of re-Christianized, if you like,
Yes.
through a whole process of broadening my perspective. And so back to our issue about directness, I will acknowledge that in the early 2000s, which is when you and I met, I was probably quite obnoxious because I felt that I had discovered, like, look at this whole world, no one's talking about it. I mean, people were talking about it, but in my world, no one had been talking about it.
Yes.
And so I was effectively running around saying, hey, listen, folks, everything you're doing is wrong, but don't worry, follow me, this is the way. And I mean, I didn't say it in those so many words, but there were a few pastors, fellow pastors of mine around Sydney anyway, who just said, look, I just think maybe we need to see less of each other because you're basically telling me everything that I do is worthless. So, it's like anything. I mean, maybe when someone first becomes a Christian, they get very obnoxious about wanting to share
Oh,
their
yeah.
faith with others. And I think I went through a similar kind of experience because there was such a remarkable sense of it just felt so right for me
Yes.
to recognize actually, the kingdom of God is not just about my soul going to heaven one day. The kingdom of God is unfurling right now throughout the world, and it includes things not just like an experience of the presence of God and his grace, and not just like an experience of a new kind of family in Christ, but also things like reconciliation and justice and healing and a whole new way of being human. And it just felt like all the pieces kind of clunked into place at last. And it all kind of made sense. And so, yeah, maybe I was a bit arrogant or obnoxious in the way I used to tell everyone how wrong they were.
It's interesting because it was really in the early 2000s that you and Alan wrote The Shaping of Things to Come, which became such a seminal book for the missional movement. And, it's interesting that it really must have come out of that time of, of a deconstruction and reconstruction that you were going through. So why do you think people were attracted to it and the incarnational model that it proposed?
Yeah, why people were attracted to that book, I really don't know. I can't explain it. But I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful that God used it in that way. And you're right, it did come out of that process of renewal that I was going through. Around that time, I met Alan Hirsch. So I mentioned a number of authors that I was reading, and broadening my perspective. And Alan Hirsch and I met at that time.
Mhm.
And he had gone through a similar process a bit earlier than me. And we became kind of learning buddies in a sense,
Mhm.
sharing material with each other. And we really shepherded each other through that process of kind of broadening our understanding around the mission of God, around the
Mm.
kingdom of God, and around God's people and our place in that world. So as we were going through that process of discovery together, um, we found that there are a lot of other people who are on a similar journey or wanting to go on a similar journey, and so we began a network which we ended up calling Forge, the Forge Mission Training Network. And we just started teaching people stuff we'd been learning. And out of that, we then thought we would write that material up as a book or booklet. We even thought probably we'll just photocopy it and hand it out to people as a kind of handbook or textbook to this training course. It effectively was the curriculum really,
Mm.
and that became the shaping of things to come. And neither Alan had never written before. I'd written a few books before this, but essentially we each wrote a book and then we tried to mash it together, Christine. So it became like this, 1,000-word book, and it was like a complete mess. We submitted it to the publisher, Hendrickson, and I don't know. I'd love to have seen the look on their faces when they looked at it. It was just a big Frankenstein monster of a book. So they, interestingly, gave it to Alan Roxburgh and said,
Ah, uh-huh.
"Can you do anything with this?" And so Alan, God bless him, actually kind of edited the book, and then
Oh,
happened to be in Sydney one day, and he and I sat down and he showed me, this was the days where you edited books on pieces of paper with red pens.
yes.
He's
Yes.
showing me big lines slashing through things and move this section here and do. So he helped to knock it into shape and obviously to reduce its size. And in the end, I think both Alan Hirsch and I both thought, oh, look, we've lost any sense of where this book is at. It had just taken so long. So we just hit, print, and out it came. So all that to say, that's why I'm so surprised it has had the impact it
It's
had.
fascinating. It is amazing, isn't it? I mean, you know that God is in something when it happens like that. Uh,
Christine, people would say to me, I read your book and I quit my job and I went and started this new business or
mhm, mhm.
planted this new community or did this, that, or the other thing. I mean, I would hear that a lot back in the day.
Yes.
And I used to say to Alan, gee, I hope we were right. I mean, I hope we're not leading people astray because people aren't just reading this book, they are actually going off and living it. And
Mhm,
that's why I say I'm so grateful. I'm just so grateful to have had the opportunity to be part of that and to have seen people like really do beautiful and creative
mhm,
community work and social work and business and church work as a result of that book, even though it had such, I think, an inauspicious kind of beginning. And if I had to write it again, I think I could make it much better, Christine. um, but but it is what it is, and it did what it did, and I can
yes.
only put it down to God. I think
Mhm,
it was just it spoke into a general feeling that people had at the time, a sense of dissatisfaction with business as usual when it came to kind of church and mission. It was we didn't say anything that people like David Bosch and Leslie Newbegin, especially Newbegin, and the
mhm,
American New Beginning guys like Roxburgh himself and others. We didn't say anything I don't think that they hadn't already said, but somehow I think we managed to, and this may be back to our Australianness you were talking about before, we managed to say it in a kind of colloquial,
mhm,
direct kind
mhm,
of way that the average kind of reader could really access and make sense of and feel like it spoke for them and not just
mhm,
to them. That was the feedback I often got because I'd say, "Oh, read Newbegin," and people would say, "Oh, I read Newbegin. I have trouble kind of following what he's saying, but the way you guys wrote about it just made sense." So maybe
mhm.
what we did was we popularized those
Yes.
kinds of ideas that we'd been exploring.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's interesting because Tom had the same kind of response to the mustard seed conspiracy,
Yep,
like 20 years before.
yep,
And I mean, we still meet people that say, "Oh, I read that book, and this is what I did."
yep,
It's scary, to realize they reshaped their whole lives,
yep.
uh, you know, based on things that we. I mean, it makes you realize the responsibility we have when we write and when we speak to people as well.
Yeah,
Um,
I totally agree. And I think because, I mean, that happened to me quite early, 20 years ago. Um, it certainly gave me that sense that, you don't just casually churn out a book
mhm.
and don't just write stuff you're kind of still half-heartedly thinking through and you're not sure if, but anyway, I'll put it out anyway, see what you think, because people take it seriously. And I
Yes.
think, don't publish anything that you don't live and that you don't genuinely believe and that you don't really want to commend to others. Writing shouldn't be an end in itself. I don't think it should be. I don't
No.
think that publishing should be an end in itself. Well, the end is that we want to actually inspire, equip, educate. And if books do that, okay, we'll publish books. But if you do it another way, I'll do it another way. Um, I get a little bit concerned about lots of young pastors who all feel like they need to be published in order to
Mhm.
kind of, validate what they're doing. And I don't think that's the case at all.
No, I think that we have to live a few years in the trenches before we are really able to write authentically about the things
Yeah,
that we're doing.
yeah,
One of your books that I don't think has had nearly as much publicity, but which I found interesting, was Keep Christianity Weird. I mean, the title itself is great as far as I'm concerned. And in it, you say we're called to be eccentric, off center, unique, different, not conformed to the patterns of the world, but transformed by the renewing of our minds. This is something that I um, definitely adhere to. And, you know, encouraging people to resist the allure not only of consumerism but of the acceptable, being willing to be different. Tell us a little bit more about that and why you think it is so important to move away from the allure of the acceptable.
yeah. Well, I mean, I think that this was what was the most appealing thing about the early church and the very earliest Christians was that they just weren't like anything anyone in the empire had ever seen before. I mean, I was teaching yesterday on church planting in a class at the college where I teach, and I was trying to explain to people how even the love feast, the kind of the weekly gathering of the earliest Christians, it wasn't just a bit different from anything anyone had seen. It was utterly and totally unbelievable that men and women, enslaved people and free people, Jews and Gentiles, barbarians, Romans, rich and poor, that these people would all sit shoulder by shoulder around a table and break bread together. I mean, there were lots of gatherings, like guild meetings, where you walk past a public space with a big long table and there'd be a bunch of men sitting around eating a meal. And even there would be a religious dimension to it. They'd have a burnt offering and pray to the gods of their industry, whatever the case may be. But they would all be men. They would all be free men. They would all be men of the same socioeconomic background. And if you weren't a man or if you weren't in that business, that industry, I mean, they just ignored you. You were invisible to them. You just walked past them and they paid you no mind. But when you came across a love feast, whether it was in someone's home or in a garden or park, I mean, it was just viscerally stunning to see this gathering. I mean, people would have done a double take, like, what is happening? And as they approached, they would hear that enslaved woman prophesying, and then that barbarian man leading in song, and then this businessman kind of sharing a word, and then they would see this extraordinary movement of God through this most unlikely of gatherings. And the beautiful thing about the Christians is that they would say, "Hey, friend, if you're on your way home from dinner and there's more than enough food, here, come, eat our meats, drink our wine." And when they said, like, "Who is your God? Like, where is he? Which God up there are you worshipping, the Christians would say, we don't have to send smoke up to the heavens. Our God isn't up there. Like, our God promised us whenever we gathered like this, he would be here amongst us. Our God, Jesus, sits at this table, and we break this bread and we drink this wine in remembrance of him and conscious of the fact that he's very present at this very table. And no one had heard anything like that before.
Yeah.
I think it's Howells, I'm not sure, who said that the Christians conquered the Roman Empire not with swords and spears, but with tables. I mean,
Yes.
the table was eccentric. It was utterly unbelievable, and people were incredibly drawn to it. And now I'm not proposing that, in snowy, wintry Seattle, you can do church outdoors around a long table. Like, I'm not saying we emulate the early church in that respect, literally, but metaphorically, the idea that we could kind of foster communities that are so radically hospitable,
Yes.
blessed by kind of a sacred form of conviviality and joy that welcome all, that are inclusive and loving. This is eccentric, and eccentric literally just means off center. And so I think the earliest Christians were off center. They weren't normal, and actually that was appealing. And one of the reasons I wrote the book was because I feel as though I've heard so many pastors trying to equip their churches in how to be normal, and like, don't be weird, don't look strange, buy the same kind of house everyone else has, send your kids to the same schools they go to, go on the same overseas vacations they go on. Like, just look like everyone else in order to show them how you can be normal and be a follower of Jesus. But that was never the way Christians operated.
No.
In fact, whenever Christianity veered toward the conventional or the normal or the regular, throughout history, you can find it just flares to life. An eccentric form of Christianity bursts forth. And that could be something like, the Celtic Christianity of the 5th century, or it could be the Benedictines or the Franciscans or the Moravians or the Pentecostals. I mean, you find it throughout history where the church might veer. Generally, the church might veer toward conservatism and institutionalism and conventionality, but it's almost like the rocket bursts to life, and these eccentric ones push us back out into kind of weirder territory. And I think that we need to be conscious of that. We need to show that actually one of the most appealing things about Christianity is that it's not just like everything else.
Yeah. Well, and I think the table fellowship, of course, is so much at the center. I think for Lent this year, I read a book by Richard Rohr
Yeah.
on the Beatitudes. And one of the things that really struck me in it, he talks about how there are two uses of bread and wine of what is it? Bread and drink. That's right. Bread and drink in the gospel that Jesus uses them. One of them is what became the Eucharist. The other one is the bread and the fish, which is an example of table fellowship and generosity. And he says, unfortunately, we held on to one and we let go of the other.
Yeah, yeah.
Because one of them was very much the love feasts of the early church. But the communion was much easier to ritualize, he said, and it took a lot less out of people. So it was much easier to grab hold of.
Sure.
Whereas the table fellowship was much harder. And it's true, but every time it seems to me that there's a real move of the spirit, it's that table fellowship that comes back in.
Yeah, and in fact, you're seeing it flaring up around America and Australia and other places with dinner
Yes,
churches happening at the moment. And
yes.
yeah, and that's not just, a home group or a small group or a dinner party. It's actually an intentional gathering around food, um, with the view of inclusion, hospitality, conviviality. I think is it Lenny Russell who says the church should be three kinds of tables. It should be the round table, that is to say, like a business round table. It should be collaborative. It should be open to ideas, wanting to hear everyone's voice. So in that kind of the best sense of the kind of business round table. It should be the kitchen table, and she does sort of harken back to a older time when kids would do their homework at the kitchen
Mm,
table and mum would shell peas at the kitchen table and some panhandler might come to the kitchen door offering to do some work around the house or the property for food, where the husband and wife would do the budget at the kitchen table. That place where the table is the place of doing the work of family
mm,
and
mm,
generosity. And then she says it should also be so a round table, a kitchen table, and it should also be a dinner party table. She calls it a
mm,
welcome
mhm.
table. But it just ought to be a fun place of conviviality and storytelling and laughter and good food and good wine. And I think all three of those tables are important. It's not just a dinner party. Church is not just a dinner party. It's not just conviviality. It's work, and it's not just work. It's also collaborative. It's also creative. I mean, it's all three of those tables. And I think that's a helpful way to think about it.
Oh, I think that's lovely. Yeah, I haven't heard that before, but I think that's really wonderful. Yeah, definitely. Now, your most recent book, Mission is the Shape of Water. Now, um, and you challenge the church to draw from its rich history to redefine mission. And I agree, we really need to redefine mission. And, excuse me, and to expand our understanding of what mission is all about. It's fascinating to me because over the last few months, I have interviewed several people with different views of mission, including Alan Roxburgh, but also Ian Mobsby, who talks about
Yep.
contemplation as mission, and Kevin Sweeney from Honolulu, who talks about mission as the cosmic Christ. He talks about, no, what is it? The cosmic Christ, the concrete Jesus, and how we have to bring those two together to really fully experience the ministry of the church. And it's interesting to me that, we are looking at new approaches to mission. And how do you feel that the history of the church really plays into this? I mean, I think David Bosch helped me to understand some of the changes of the historic understanding of mission. But it's
Yeah.
wonderful to see this happening again today. And how do you feel that, this book that you have written, does this play into this?
Yeah, well, Bosch looks at paradigms of mission, doesn't he? Like
Yes.
big sweeps of history, big eras, I suppose. And then in the 80s is that exploring kind of what was a very influential kind of conversation around what we would now call a kind of a missional perspective. But uh, I teach a subject at Morling called the history of Christian mission, and uh, lots of students who take it, they may take it because they've heard it's a good class or that I'm, good at teaching it or something, but they often come in with no knowledge about the history of Christian mission at all. So it's not
Mm,
like I'm a real keen student of history of Christian mission and I want to do this class to learn more. They know almost nothing. And what I've discovered is that and this may be an Australian thing, I don't know, but a lot of people are really bereft when it comes to any awareness of the marvelous things that God's people have done throughout
mm.
history.
Oh, no, I think that's pretty general. Yes.
Right. And I think that one of the things that the study of history does is it frees us in our own age. Because sometimes we can feel as though we live in a world where this is the way it has always been, and the church has always been like this, and these are the things that are obsessing us, and they've always obsessed Christians all the time, and the challenges we're dealing with have never, they're peculiar to us. Nothing has kind of really changed. And then when you study the history of Christian mission, you actually discover no, actually, mission has looked very different in different contexts.
Mhm,
Sometimes it's been quite combative. Sometimes it's been quite muscular, and I use that word advisedly. Sometimes it has been very gentle and warm. At other times, it has been concerned with nation building. At other times, it's been concerned or linked with imperialism. At other times, it's been deeply concerned about the grassroots and social justice and the poor. That Christian mission has taken different forms at different places and in different contexts around the world. And that's the reason for the title. I say mission is like the shape of water, insofar as the essential nature of mission, I don't think changes, but its shape is determined by the context into which it's been poured. Because when you think about it, the mission of God's people is a gift to society. So the society ought to have some say over what that's going to look like. And so I go through 10 different shapes that Christian mission has taken throughout the ages. And the point of it is to say, we are now free to determine what this might look like in our day and time. That there are peculiarities about living in the 2020s. There are unique challenges that I don't think that people have faced before, like climate change, like digital communications and AI and things like that. These are very, very peculiar issues to our generation. But so many of the other issues that we're facing actually have been addressed at various points throughout history, and we can take comfort and encouragement from them. But I think the bottom line is to be freed from thinking that you've got to do the way it's always been done when it hasn't always been done this way.
Yeah, no, it's true. I think I love to see these new model of mission, new models of mission that are coming out as people engage different aspects of the culture, as they engage different ethnicities and recognize that people from different ethnic groups have different approaches to mission. I think it's a fascinating time to be a part of God's mission into the world.
Can I tell you one of my favorite stories from the book, which is
Yes, please.
kind of helpful to their conversation? It concerns a couple of British Baptist missionaries, the Harrises, Alice and John Harris. Alice Seeley Harris was a young woman heading off to the Bololo region of southern Africa, which is just outside what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. As she was about to leave, they were going to do conventional conversionist Baptist mission. They were going to preach the Bible, baptize people, teach them how to be good Christians. That was the plan. If you see pictures of her, Christine, she looks exactly like Catherine Hepburn in The African Queen, if you remember.
Yep.
There's the white linen dress and the big white hat. She is picture perfect, late 19th century missionary. But as she's about to leave, somebody gives her a really precious gift. They give her a personal camera. And personal cameras were not widely in use in the 1890s. So it was quite an expensive gift. But this person said, take some photos of what you're doing out there, and then maybe you can come back one day and show us what it looks like, which, of course, is standard fare for cross-cultural workers these days. But in the 1890s, this was kind of crazy town. So she takes her little camera off to the Bololo River, and you can see her photos. There's pictures of her with a big stick pointing to a blackboard, and she's, teaching lessons from the Bible. It's all very conventional. But right across the river in the Congo at that very time was one of the greatest human rights violations in history, one of the worst atrocities of the 20th century, which was the Belgian Congo's treatment of the Congolese people for the extraction of ivory and rubber. We don't know how many millions of people were tortured, maimed, and murdered in order that the King of Belgium should extract as much rubber and ivory as possible. It's just an outrageous story, and it was maintained by a private mercenary army. It's absolutely monstrous. She's on the Bololo River, so she doesn't really know about this until one day a man stumbles into the mission station carrying body parts from his wife and daughter. And he explains to her that this was standard practice, that if you don't deliver enough ivory or rubber, that you have to make up the tear, the weight, by having a limb removed and added to the weight. And that his wife and daughter had been slaughtered, and he managed to carry away just a few remnants of them to bury them properly. Now, she's stunned by this story, and she could well have ministered to this man and just continued with her conversionist mission, really. But God love her, this woman is so touched by this story, she asks him to take her into the Congo, and she starts to make a number of surreptitious illegal trips into the Congo where she photographs people with hands and arms have been removed, with scars across their chests, with eyes taken out. She writes down testimonies of people being drowned or raped to death. Terrible, terrible, terrible stories. And she collects this dossier of information and all of these photographs. And she does this at great personal risk, actually. And having gathered enough information, she and her husband John then return to the UK and they do a speaking tour around the United Kingdom, reading out these testimony statements and showing the photographs as slideshows. And they have such monumental impact that they're then invited to the United States. They do something like a 20-city tour around the United States. They're then invited to France, number of countries. They're not the only advocates for the Congolese, but a number of people advocating on behalf of the Congolese, together with these photographs. Within just 3 years, actually, the Belgian Congo is dismantled and King Leopold withdraws from it. It's an extraordinary story
Yeah.
of advocacy. Now, if you look up Alice Seeley Harris, you can find her photographs and read her stories.
Mm.
They're extraordinary. But here's my point, is that she's regarded by the human rights community as one of the greatest pioneer advocates and celebrated in that respect. But she was a Christian missionary, and she
Yes.
saw this work as Christian mission. It was
Yes.
truth-telling and advocacy. Now, I tell her story in that book because she goes to Balolo with a particular shape in mind.
Mhm.
I'm going to teach lessons to children with blackboards and sticks, you know. But when she gets there, the context reshapes her perspective.
Mhm.
A challenge is presented to her. You can stay on this river and keep teaching these kids, or you can actually go and collect these stories and advocate on behalf of the millions of Congolese who are suffering as a result of it. And her bravery and her creativity is inspirational to us because she was willing to let go of the shape that she thought that
Mhm.
she went initially to commit to and embraced a different shape given the
Mhm.
circumstances or the context in which she finds herself. And I find her story instructive in the sense that I think for us today, sometimes we're holding on to shapes that may have been useful elsewhere or at a previous time. But sometimes we need to embrace the courage and the creativity to let go of beloved shapes and to allow the context to
Mhm.
shape what mission might look like today.
Amen. Yeah. Oh, that is an amazing story. And particularly considering she is a woman as well at that
Yep.
time.
Yep.
It's quite remarkable. And as you said, the bravery of it. That actually is a good point to end on, I think, to remind ourselves that God does call us to be brave, to be advocates, and to think and be willing to step outside the boxes that we have placed ourselves in order to do the things that God calls us to do.
Yep. Absolutely.
Thank you, Michael. I've really appreciated this time with you.
Not at all. I enjoyed it. Finally, we got it done.
Yes, I'm so glad. So glad. In today's conversation, Mike Frost shared his journey from a conventional upbringing to becoming an advocate for social justice and a voice for activism in the church. He discussed the importance of understanding the intersection of faith and activism, the role of Australians in global conversations, and the impact of his work, particularly the book, The Shaping of Things to Come. Mike emphasized the need for the church to embrace eccentricity and adapt its mission to the context of modern society, drawing on historical examples of transformative figures like Alice Seeley Harris. In the next episode of Liturgical Rebels, I will be in conversation with Reverend Dr. Ash Barker, who leads the Seedbed School for Shalom at Nazarene Theological College in Birmingham, England. An urban missiologist, Shalom activist, and pioneer minister, Ash has over 40 years of experience in unlocking the potential of local communities on 3 continents. Originally from Melbourne, Australia, Ash lived and served for 12 years in Bangkok's largest slum before relocating to inner-city Birmingham. He is a dynamic speaker and the author of 9 books, including No Wastelands. As founder and executive director of Seedbeds International, he works to release the unique potential within local people and places around the world through Seedbeds affiliates and partners. Ash lives in intentional community at Newbigin House in Winson Green with his wife Angie, where they have also planted and lead 2 new local congregations with the United Reformed Church. He is passionate about pilgrimages, football, and helping communities flourish in the most unlikely places. I am Christine Syne, the author of Celtic Advent Following an Unfamiliar Path and The Gift of Wonder. My other books include Digging Deeper, The Art of Contemplative Gardening, and To Garden with God. I also write regularly on Substack at Walking in Wonder with Christine Syne. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the podcast. Please also share it with your friends or join me on Substack, Instagram, or Facebook.